that what we have seen is that Democrats from the states have worked to make a deal better that the Prime Minister was rushing to ratify that could have undermined the work that has resulted in what looks like a better deal. That to me is deeply problematic, and we should never let that happen again. It should never happen again that politicians in another country are protecting workers in Canada. That should be the role and the job of our government. So that is my deep concern. With respect to the changes, I think that there's been some indication of positive changes, and those are encouraging. But I want to really highlight that we should never let this happen again, that other politicians in other countries are protecting our workers, and I want to put forward a solution to that, and we'll be talking about that with my question today in question period, but we've got a series of steps we can take to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Will you support it, though?
Will
you support the NDP support the new deal?
So at this point, we're not coming out with a position on whether we're supporting it or not. I want to read the deal, understand the details of it first. But I can say that some of it that I've seen so far is encouraging, and that is a good thing. But what my deep concern that I want to raise is that how is it ever possible that the Prime Minister would be trying to rush through the ratification of something that is now ostensibly looks like it's better, and it was made better not by our own politicians, not by Canada, but made better by politicians in another country that are working to protect our workers. That to me is a problem.
What was the...
Donc ce que je trouve inquiétant, c'est que les politiciens dans un autre pays, ils ont fait le travail pour aider les travailleurs ici au Canada, au lieu de notre gouvernement, notre Premier ministre ici au Canada, il a essayé de signer l'accord tout de suite, et ça a eu le potentiel de créer des problèmes pour les politiciens aux États-Unis qui ont voulu améliorer l'accord. Je trouve ça tellement inquiétant. Donc, on va proposer des étapes pour s'assurer que dans l'avenir, on n'est jamais dans une position où notre gouvernement essaie d'aller trop vite pour signer un accord sans avoir fait tout le travail possible de rendre l'accord plus positif pour les travailleurs et travailleuses.
Qu'est-ce que vous pensez des dispositions sur l'aluminium?
C'est aussi un enjeu qui est inquiétant. Ce que j'ai lu, ce qu'on a vu, c'est des problèmes potentiels pour le secteur de l'aluminium ici au Canada. Et c'est inquiétant. Et je veux s'assurer que tous les accords protègent les industries au Canada au lieu de leur faire mal. Et j'ai des inquiétudes par rapport à ça.
Mais est-ce que ça vous amènerait à voter contre? Est-ce que ça vous amènerait à voter contre si ces dispositions-là sont maintenues?
Donc, à ce moment, on n'a pas une position parce qu'on n'a pas encore lire tous les détails de cet accord. Donc, on va le lire, on va l'évaluer et puis on va prendre une décision.
What are your worries about aluminum in English?
So we're concerned about the potential impacts to the aluminum sector. These are some of the worries that have been raised with the agreement. I want to understand those better, but I can just say as a broad statement that agreements should strengthen industry and manufacturing in our country, shouldn't create barriers, shouldn't create problems, and the fact that we're seeing potentially there could be a negative impact to the aluminum sector, to me, is problematic, and another reason why we want to review the agreement to understand all the details before coming out with a position.
You mentioned positive changes that you saw. What are those? What do you like in the new things we've heard?
So far we've heard a couple of things. One is I've been calling for and calling out the fact that the language that protects labor and environment was not enforceable. And without enforceability, what's the point? And the work that the Democrats in the states were doing was basically to take those protections and make them enforceable. And so that's what it seems like has been achieved. The other element that has been achieved is we were deeply concerned with the previous agreement that had been worked out, that it could increase the cost of medication pretty dramatically. With what we're seeing in some of the changes, those concerns seem to be addressed. So those are some of the positive signs. Again, I want to make sure we look at the details before coming out with a position. But I also, again, want to highlight that it shouldn't have taken Democrats in the United States. It shouldn't have taken politicians in another country to protect Canadians and workers in Canada. That, to me, should never happen again. We should not have a case, and I think we should ask the question, Why was the Prime Minister trying to rush to sign a deal that now has become better because more time has passed and Democrats were able to do their work? That to me is troubling. I'll come right back to that first.
Yesterday, National Chief Perry Bellegarde came out and said that the new deal is the most progressive trade agreement in history and will greatly benefit First Nations. Are you disagreeing or agreeing with him on that?
Well, I respect the opinion of Indigenous leaders when they make comments about the impact of legislation or agreements, and so I'll take that into consideration. I want to take a look at the details of this agreement to see if that is, in fact, the case. If there are certainly protections in place for Indigenous communities, that to me is important. So I want to make sure I take a look to confirm that. And that's going to be something that should be an element of any of our trade agreements, that we look at the impact to Canadians, to workers, and to Indigenous communities. So that's important, and we'll take a look at that when we make our analysis and evaluation of the details of the agreement. Do you have a question?
So I'm just wondering,
I'll come
why
back to
do
it.
you think it took the Democrats, why didn't the Liberals push forward these changes? Why do you think it took?
That is mind-boggling. To me, it makes no sense. I can't fathom any world where the government of a country, our country, rushes to try to sign a deal that has now been made better because we didn't rush. And we've been calling for the Prime Minister to slow down and say, listen, if there's work being done, why are you rushing to sign it? And I can't in any way come up with any justification for why the Prime Minister thought it was okay to try to rush ahead to sign a deal when he knew that rushing ahead to sign the deal could undermine the work that was being done in the States to make it better. I think it would be pretty normal to assume that the government of Canada, that the Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, would be working in the best interests of workers, the best interests of Canadians, and if there was any suggestion that the bill could be made better, he would be doing everything possible to make it better. That does not seem that it was the case. It looks like there was a gamble. He was working against that gamble, and luckily, politicians in another country made the deal seemingly better for Canadians and for Canadian workers. It should never be a gamble. It should never be by chance that we got to this position. It should be because we're working for it. And that's what I'm deeply concerned about. And I can't answer why the Prime Minister seemed to be rushing to get something signed that could have undermined the work that was done to make it better.
I understand that you say you want to look at the details. What would be a red line for you in terms of not being able to support it?
Well, it's hard to determine what a red line is without knowing the details, without understanding what the implications are. I can tell you a general red line for me is that a deal that hurts workers, that hurts Canadians, that hurts Indigenous people is a deal that, to me, is not one we should sign. So for me, the lens has to be, will this deal have a net positive benefit on working people? What we've seen in the past is deals have certainly benefited rich corporations. They've certainly not hurt multinationals. And that shouldn't be our lens, though. If it's going to benefit a multinational, powerful corporation, that shouldn't be the criteria that we use to decide whether we agree with a trade agreement or not. It should be, will this create more jobs for Canadians? Will it protect our jobs? Will it create a competitive environment for Canadian manufacturing to thrive? Those should be our criteria. Does it protect our environment? Does it protect Indigenous people and our culture? Those are the things that I want to see happen.
Given the fact that the Bloc leader has said that they're probably not going to support this, does that place more pressure on you to actually vote in favor of it?
No, I want to make sure that our decision is not based on whether other parties are going to support or not support, that the decision we make is in the best interest of Canadians. I want to make sure that we make a decision that actually makes sure workers have a better shot at building a good life. We know there's a lot of fear and a lot of worry across Canada about jobs, and I don't want us to end up signing another deal that in any way jeopardizes good jobs. For me, that's got to be the priority, and that puts working people and Canadians first, not those at the top of the companies, but those who work in those companies. And that, to me, has got to be our priority.
If 3 opposition parties oppose this, don't you feel a responsibility to have this approved and not find ourselves without any agreement?
So for me, it's if the agreement's going to hurt Canadians, then we're not better off with it. And so I want to make sure that we're making a decision based on what's in the best interest of Canadians. If it turns out that it's going to protect workers and it's going to create jobs here, then yes, it's a deal that we should, move ahead with. We want to take a look at the deal to make sure that it's the right type of deal, that it's good for Canada. Did you have you mentioned before, and then I'll come right to you.
Sorry, you mentioned, I guess, that you never want to see this situation where the Democrats are standing up for Canadian workers ever happen again, and that you might have some solution to prevent that from happening. Can you explain, how would you how would that work? What are you talking about?
Right. So, I mean, I'm happy that in this case the Democrats stepped up, but I'm saying it shouldn't ever be the case that we hope for someone else, an intervener, to come in to make the deal better to protect Canadian jobs and Canadians. That should never happen. It shouldn't be that we hope for some other party to negotiate for our benefit. We should be doing that. So a couple of things are just laying out some clear goals. What are the goals of trade agreements? What are we trying to achieve? And putting that out there in the public sphere. So we know that the goals are to protect Canadian jobs, or the goals are to ensure that our Canadians can compete in a global market. Putting out the goals broadly. Right now what we saw was a lot of discussions that happened behind closed doors without even providing a general sense of the direction that Canadians want to move in. I understand that some negotiations are specific and are sensitive and can't be in the public, but the general values could be out there. And we've seen the States. That is commonplace. It's commonplace that the general value of what the direction of the trade agreement is going to take, that's put out into the public sphere and people talk about it. And so we've got a bill that we want to put forward that outlines some of the steps that can be taken and some of the criteria that should be fulfilled before we go ahead with a trade deal, and some of the process that we should follow. It should involve Canadians having input on what's good for them. It should involve workers and people who represent workers having an input in terms of what's going to benefit working people, not solely having the lens of what's going to make the bottom line better for a rich multinational corporation that happens to work out of Canada. But we want to see what's going to actually create jobs and make people have an opportunity that is long-lasting and competitive. That's what we want to see.
Obviously, dealing with Donald Trump proved to be a challenge for the Canadian government during the throes of these negotiations. In fact, Donald Trump at one point threatened that he was going to rip up NAFTA. Do you appreciate that if things are stalled in terms of ratification here, that could prove to be problematic in dealing with a U.S. administration that has had some challenges until this point?
Well, I just would turn us back. You know, we have the opportunity of hindsight, just looking a little bit back, and we could see that the Trudeau government tried to rush ahead and sign a deal. And at that time, I repeatedly called on the government to slow down and say, well, we've got clear indication. Our members of parliament are working with Democrats in the States who are telling us that they're working to make this deal better. We told the government repeatedly, do not rush ahead when we see that there's work being done to make the deal better. The government didn't listen, and they continued to try to rush ahead, which could have jeopardized the good work that we're now seeing might have happened to make the deal better. Similarly, if we've got a deal and now we look at it, and if it's actually not better, if looking at the details it turns out it hasn't really improved the lot for workers, it hasn't really improved protections for the environment, it hasn't really protected the cost of medication for families, then maybe it is something that we should move ahead with. We've got to make sure that the deal makes sense. And I think that is the right way to move forward. And so I'm not worried about delays. I'm worried about signing an agreement that is good for Canada, that is good for workers, that's good for people.
But what about the economic uncertainty that could come with a deal not being ratified?
Certainly that's a concern. Economic uncertainty, particularly in Canada now, when we've got a lot of people worried about the future, is something to consider. But when you lock yourself into a trade agreement, it creates a condition that's going to be long-lasting. And I think a little bit of uncertainty before we enter into a deal to make sure the deal is good for Canada in the long term, it's probably a good thing to do. It's probably makes sense to make sure we are thoughtful before we enter into agreement that's going to be something we're tied to for a long time. And I'm very aware of economic insecurity. It's something that I know is keeping a lot of people up late at night. They're worried about their future. But I want to make sure we make decisions that are long-lasting, that'll create a competitive environment for Canada, not just for the short term, the next year, but for the next decade and years to follow.
In non-NAFTA news,
yes.
the Tex Frontier oil sands mine has been in the news, and I don't think I've heard your position on whether or not the federal government should improve the mine. What does the NDP think about that?
So we have three criteria when it comes to general energy projects and resource development projects, which would apply in this case as well. Three criteria. First off, it's got to satisfy all the environmental concerns. So any environmental regulations, assessments have to be satisfied meaningfully. Secondly, it's got to respect indigenous rights, indigenous communities' rights, and ensure that those steps are taken in a meaningful way. And finally, it's got to create a benefit for Canadian jobs and Canadian workers. And if it does those three things, it's a project we can look at moving forward. If it doesn't do those things, there shouldn't be a project that goes ahead.
Feel this project does?
At this
Because
point,
the communities, the indigenous communities have signed an agreement. The evaluation was done and it was positive, and obviously it will create jobs.
so the two areas where I'm concerned, I've heard some concerns being raised, and I think it still needs to be assessed, is the environmental impact is something that has been raised as a serious concern. Given the longevity of the project, it's projected to be more than 40 years in terms of its life. And there's been some concerns raised by indigenous communities. I'm not satisfied yet that those have been dealt with, and if they're responded to in a meaningful way, then it's something we can look at. If it's not addressed and it's not been satisfied that the environmental concerns or the indigenous concerns are addressed, then it's not something we should go ahead with. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.